I would like to formally say hello and welcome to the panelists and, of course, our attendees, and introduce the Gaming Standards Association webinar on sports betting. This is part of what we refer to as the IGSA Technology Summit series. In the past, pre-pandemic, we used to do these as live events, as so many conferences used to be. And this year we decided to do it virtually, although I would imagine that maybe next year we'll do it in person again. I want to thank our panelists for being part of this event. And what I'll do is I'll introduce them shortly, but first and foremost, I'd like to reiterate what the scope of this webinar session is, which is, is utilizing applied sciences such as blockchain, cloud technologies, and other technologies, an acceptable approach in a highly regulated sector like gaming. And if so, sort of what are the jurisdictional issues that we might encounter from a laboratory perspective, from a regulatory approval perspective, and of course from an implementation perspective once those approvals come through. So I'll introduce myself very quickly, and then I'll introduce each of the panelists, and I'll allow them to expound a little by giving us a little bit of their bio, and then we'll get into the session specifically. Before I do that, a couple of housekeeping items. As I'm sure you've heard, this session is being recorded, and this will be posted on our YouTube, our LinkedIn, and potentially our Twitter sites as well. So you can always listen to this and also share it with your colleagues. If you have questions during the webinar, please go ahead and type them into the Q&A section of your Zoom screen. It should be an option on the bottom of your screen. We'll take a look at those questions, and we'll either address them in line if the question is sort of topical to what we're discussing at the moment, or we'll address them at the end of our meeting. So with that, my name is Mark Pace. I'm the Vice President of IGSA and the Managing Director of GSA Europe. I've been working with GSA for the past 15 plus years, representing a number of gaming companies. And about 3 years ago, I joined as a staff member of GSA. And I'm very grateful to have 3 individuals with a lot of expertise, and more importantly, with a different viewpoint into the topics that we'll be discussing today. It is my pleasure to introduce first and foremost a gentleman whose work really puts him, I believe, at the cutting edge of all the new products that are being developed and being submitted for testing. Very happy to have currently the Director of Engineering Digital at GLI, Mr. Joe Carlon. Joe, welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and to speak with everybody. Just a little background, I've been with GLI for 17 years and manage a set of teams that are global, that specialize in testing of sports, online sports, sports retail, and online casino products for jurisdictions in the US and also globally.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Next up, a gentleman who for the past many months has been absolutely laser focused on sports betting because his jurisdiction approved it and they went live at the beginning of the year. Somebody who's living sports betting from a regulatory perspective. Currently, he's the chairperson of IGSA's regulatory committee and also the chief technology and gaming officer at the Ohio Casino Control Commission, Mr. Chris Fleenor. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Mark. Glad to be here. So yeah, I've, like Joe, have been in the gaming industry for about 18 years, so just a little bit more than Joe. I've been on the regulatory side of that fence since I started. So started initially in the jurisdiction of Missouri, and eventually came over to Ohio once Ohio established gaming.
Very good. Thank you very much for your participation. And last but not least, a gentleman who has worn many hats in the industry, as I mentioned in a webinar yesterday that he participated in. Somebody I've gone to for rational, reasonable, and well thought out solutions to regulatory problems I've had in the past. and one who has listened to me patiently and sometimes told me to go away and sometimes gave me some really good advice on how to proceed. An ex-Nevada Gaming Board member and currently running his own consulting firm at Katsaros LLC, Mr. Phil Katsaros. Phil, welcome.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for that warm welcome as well. I've been in the industry, well, just about over coming on 25, 26 years now. I started out as a regulator myself for about 6 years with the Nevada Gaming Control Board, and thereafter kind of just branched out into all facets of the gaming industry, focused on land-based international gaming for a while, overseas in Europe, Asia, touched upon Australia, a bit of Africa, a bit of LATAM as well, and of course North America too, and then shifted gears at a certain point and had a more of a online gaming focus, and then kind of went full circle with my career and came back to the Nevada Gaming Control Board for the last 4 years. I had a term that expired as a board member here in February, and now I'm out there as a consultant. So thank you for having me here today.
And thank you for being here. So I went through sort of the formal panel topic. I'd like to sort of rephrase it slightly before we get into it. And I think, our topic today really is about ideas on how we can potentially streamline the application and submission process through the use of standards. And if such standards can be created, sort of what are the jurisdictional, the testing laboratory, or the approval challenges that are to be expected. So very much what I said formally in sort of my words as I was thinking about this panel and thinking about the challenges of doing this in sports betting and beyond. So gentlemen, my first question to you is, the sports betting ecosystem is comprised of a bunch of different entities, right? You've got your bookmakers, you've got your platform suppliers, you've got your operators, and the players are interacting with the platforms using computers, tablets, mobile phones, smartphones. Where do you think are there opportunities in this ecosystem for standardization? And I'll throw it out there. Anybody can start, and then please, everybody else, just expound.
Yeah, I'll jump in and throw my thoughts in there to begin with. I mean, you're right. It's a complex ecosystem. From a test lab perspective, when you look at a slot machine, you can really draw a box around that and very deterministically evaluate it and complete a certification project. And it doesn't matter to you where that's going to be deployed in terms of the casinos, what it's going to be connected to in all cases. In some cases that is a case, but AML controls, internal controls, that's different when it comes to the online world. You need to know those integrations. You need to know who those parties are and the partnerships that are being formed, because an operator can have an underlying platform that's managing player accounts, and they're an operator and they're operating that. It's coming from a technology supplier. The sportsbook could be their own technology, or it could come from somebody else, but then you're integrated also into third parties for payments, for geolocation, for identity verification, for fraud, for marketing tools. You have affiliate integrations, you have separate line feed integrations and information that's all pulling in into this one system. And it's incredibly important, if you're going to be involved in this area at all, that you understand who those parties are. It's something that I spend a lot of time on, that has nothing to do with actual evaluation of a product, but it does inform that secondarily. So that it's posed in the right way. When it comes to standardization, in my view, the operators are going to be pushing the boundaries with new technology, new products, and innovation. And when they do that at a business level, I think we all understand from the regulatory side that that's going to occur. But there's also areas where they shouldn't be competing. And those tend to be more regulatory in nature, where competition isn't a must. And areas are responsible gaming, making sure that self-exclusion lists and player lists, personally exposed players, perhaps sports league information and the like, for fraud reporting, or just data reporting for taxation or data and health on the industry in total. Those are areas where everybody needs to be top level performers, both at the operations side as well as the labs and support and the regulators, because we're talking sports. We're like the offensive lineman when you talk regulatory with respect to the industry. If we're in the news, it's a bad thing. If we're doing our job and nobody knows our name, that's a good thing. And so really, when I look at standardization, I look at where are those real opportunities to ensure that we have a strong, healthy industry that's protecting consumers and to point in those areas.
And I'll jump in next, Mark. So I agree with what Joe said. Probably would throw a couple more things in there though. And really, even all the things that Joe pointed out, to me, a lot of it comes down to just a standard way of exchanging data between the different entities that are involved. But two areas that I don't think Joe touched on, one is the markets or the wager catalog, as it's commonly known. What markets are allowed to be offered in the different jurisdictions. I think currently right now that's a huge problem, especially from an operational perspective, because every jurisdiction unfortunately has their own perspective on what should be approved or not approved in that jurisdiction. And it can become an operational nightmare to try and keep that straight. But if there's a standardized way of exchanging that data between the regulator and the operator, maybe a more automated solution could be put out there. But and then even to touch on some of the things Joe mentioned, exclusion lists, prohibited players, RG exclusions. Again, a way to anonymously and safely exchange data about individuals between operators and the regulators, or even between operators and leagues or a service that's providing data for the leagues, so that they don't have to share all of the employee and player information of their players, not the patrons, but the players themselves, right? The sports players. But there's no other way that an operator would know to not allow someone to wager. How does an operator know if someone's affiliated with the NFL if they don't have a way of checking their accounts against something without moving that data in a way that could be compromised, or the privacy could be compromised? So I think there's a lot of opportunity there for being able to exchange data in a way that is safe and anonymous. And then one other area, and Joe mentioned financial reporting, maybe not complete financial reporting, but at least from the revenue perspective, from the regulatory side of the house, I would say revenue reporting is already that financial data in general can tend to be pretty confidential in nature, but revenue reporting is pretty standardly public in most jurisdictions. So at least the ability to easily share the revenue information between a regulator and an operator would be a huge win from a regulatory perspective, because I can tell you right now, it's not the easiest thing to get sometimes. And then probably the last area I would point out would be system verification. Like Joe said, there's so many different aspects to these online systems and where they live and how many instances of each one are running. An easy standard way for a regulator and maybe even an operator to monitor their own systems and share that monitoring with the regulator, so that they have a comfort level that what's running is what was tested and what was approved. And I know there are standards out there for that. In fact, we're going through the process of making it a requirement here in Ohio. So hopefully that catches on, and what we're requiring doesn't become a one-off situation.
Yeah, and I won't try to echo too much of what they just said there, but what Chris is just saying, I'll start from there. Standardization there, if we could utilize the reporting tools that they now have in Ohio, and that could spread across the country. The goal is compliance, and the more standardization we have, the better compliance we're going to have. And there's going to be anomalies between different markets, but compliance should be the goal. It shouldn't be one market trying to one up the other, or trying to do some sort of anomaly just for the sake of being an outlier or different. If there was some sort of standardized And if I distill it down and boil it down to, say, the multi-jurisdictional form that we use for licensing, that's the baseline. Everybody can subscribe to that sort of filing process, and then they'll have their additional supplemental, right? And that's what we could have as well if we look at it from a reporting perspective or exchanging data. But the first thing I thought of right when you asked that question, though, Mark, is the other point that Chris was just mentioning is on the self-exclusions, the impermissible bettors. That's something I think is an easy win right now that we could do across the country, and it needs to happen. There's no competitive nature involved with the operators, with the platforms, with the regulators either, right? If we had some sort of mechanism to have a central registry, it's something I've been passionate about for a little while. When I was at Nevada, I was looking to sort of be a catalyst for that to spread, just like you guys are doing in Ohio, perhaps with on the reporting side and so forth. Sorry, on the protocols that you're using for your software. Is it for your software detection anomalies, if I'm quoting that correct, Chris? But regardless, that's something, for instance, other countries have led already. Australia is one that's been at the forefront of responsible gambling for decades. You can go into the 90s and they were talking about harm minimization and so forth. There's some European countries as well. We're a little behind in the US, I would say, and we're still 50 different countries. That's somewhere I think we could all sort of, rally around and say, okay, we could do this very easily utilizing proper technology. I'm actually consulting for a company that does exactly that. After I left Nevada, that was something I really wanted to sign up for and jump on, providing for that greater integrity around sports betting, around self-exclusionary registries, and assisting with the process of responsible gambling.
So since this is an IGSA webinar, and since I'm representing IGSA, I would be not remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to talk a little bit about everything that you all said and some of the things that IGSA is working on. So let me start with where we left off in responsible gaming. Whether you call it responsible gambling, whether you call it responsible gaming, safer gaming, harm minimization, give it whatever terminology you want. Ultimately, our goal as an industry is to make sure that people are protected, and the individuals that need protection are protected. The people that are self-excluded or excluded for other reasons are in fact truly excluded. But to do this in a way that is, not punitive. It has to be anonymous in terms of the data that's being shared. There has to be data protection. In Europe, we spend a lot of time dancing around the GDPR. There are GDPR-like requirements in states like California and others in the United States. So, interestingly enough, IGSA has a solution for achieving that from a centralized perspective. We just kicked off a responsible gaming committee that is comprised of a variety of different individuals, some academics, some people that are working very much and have been working in the responsible gaming area for many, many years. And we've got operators and suppliers. And I think it's really important that we get more viewpoints into this, because there are different approaches to responsible gaming. So that's number one. Two, everything that you guys talked about comes down to, as Chris pointed out, data, right? And this data has to be communicated from one point to the next point in this ecosystem. Guess what? IGSA has a protocol that was created with our European partners, our European members, who have been dealing with sports betting and online gaming for decades. And we have created a protocol much like the game to system protocol for slot machines connecting to host systems like a casino management system. We created what we call the third-party game interface, which basically is a standard API to replace the myriad of APIs that are out there, all of which are proprietary and all of which do the same thing. They share the same information in slightly different ways between all of those different components of the ecosystem. Why? Nobody competes on plumbing, right? Standardize it, get the data, provide transparency to the regulators because they want it. And then finally, once that data is coming in a transparent way, well, you have to report it. And guess what? IGSA has a regulatory reporting interface standard that was the basis for the online gaming standard that we developed for the European Commission, and which has now been adopted by all European countries. It is something that we developed with the member states, with the EU member states, and not just EU, also EEA member states. We got all of their input. We spent a year and a half working on this. We started with RRI, the online piece of RRI, because RRI does land-based and lottery as well. And we customized it specifically to the European needs. RRI is available for worldwide, covers worldwide needs. So we've got standards that already have been developed. What we need now is people to evaluate them. And by people, I mean operators, suppliers, and regulators to see if they meet the needs. And if they do, great. And if they need to be tweaked, hey, we're more than happy to do that work and figure out how to tweak them. So this was absolutely in line with what we're doing. And just to make sure, in the interest of full disclosure, we have not gone over these answers together prior to this session. So what you said was news to me, and it just happens to be in line because, quite frankly, it's common sense, right? So great. That's fantastic. Let's dig into one of these areas. I don't know where you want to start. You want to look at technology, perhaps? Is that a good place to focus on? What do you think? Technology from a regulatory testing and approval challenges. Like if there's a new piece of technology that's going to be implemented, and I don't want to harp on AI, I don't want to harp on blockchain, right? But you guys are seeing some of the technologies that are being brought to bear. What are the processes? What are the challenges for new technology to be introduced into this ecosystem and go through the approval and implementation phases? What do you think?
So I'll jump on there first. So I think the pretty standard answer is just understanding the technology and having a knowledge base around it. But I want to caveat that with it really depends on how the technology is being used or what it's being used for, right? So blockchain, AI, whatever technology it is, if an operator chooses to use it for something that has no effect on what the regulator cares about, then the regulator just, in most cases, just won't care. Like, hey, use whatever is most efficient and going to give you an operational advantage. And hey, if there's some benefit to the regulator that I get out of it, so say, hey, someone implemented RRI and it's this really automated reporting interface that I can now use. Great. It's not a regulatory requirement. So I don't know that I need to understand the full ins and outs of that technology that you're using. But as soon as it crosses that line of, hey, we're actually using this technology to meet some of these rules and regulations that you have in place, well, then I have to take a closer look at it. And depending on the technology, which generally in gaming, technology is a few years behind, so it's not necessarily new. It's already in use in other facets of industry, just not the gaming industry. So there's usually a pretty good base knowledge around the technology coming in already out there in other verticals. So that's just where, from a regulatory perspective, we start doing homework, and we would reach out to someone like Joe and say, hey, what experience do you have with this? Let's collaborate and see what we can do to make this happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's and while Chris will reach out to us, we're also going to be reaching out to Chris and our regulatory clients across the US and globally when there is innovation and new technology. The key with any level of standardization is to ensure, to the best that you can, that there are no limits on innovation and growth. That you're designing for controls and what's underlying policy intent and the things that regulators are charged with in terms of consumer protection, protecting the industry and the financials tax revenue bases, and ensuring fairness across the board, with control and oversight as well. So you have to look at those key principles when designing standardization and allow the industry to grow on top of it, because if you don't, those standards will be abandoned. But when we're looking at new technology, as Chris rightly said, it develops somewhere else, and gaming's usually not on the leading edge of adopting it. That's slightly changing right now, but it's still a little bit behind. But you look at a technology just like microservices as an example, And that's something that, can be deployed, has a lot of advantages, but then you go into governance on the regulatory side. And how do you hash critical components? How do you ensure that you have control and ongoing monitoring over that? And those are solvable problems, but it's understanding what those problems are at their foundation, and then creating standardization so that the industry knows what the rules are to go in and deploy those types of technologies. And that's key. And it's key to have those open relationships between the labs, the regulators, and the operators to know what's coming early, to discuss policy intent and design, to interpret regulation and requirements and apply that, and then set a precedence and standard going forward. And the more that we have that in the industry, and the more involved parties, including partnering with IGSA, which GLI has been a long-term partner with, is something that we're very much for.
And then the one challenge that still remains is that we have 50 different countries basically still in the US. We just boil it down to the US.
More than that, when you look at sovereign tribal.
Yeah, it's true. I stepped into that yesterday. I meant hundreds with the sovereign nations. But we need to find a way to have a better level of reciprocity between the markets. Now, I know that might translate to less sort of work for the testing labs and so forth, but we need to move to a point in time where we've got some reciprocity between the markets. We do it to some extent. I mentioned California. I got my GLI 11 certificate. I can pretty much show that anywhere around all the Native American tribes in California and some other markets as well. Guys, organizations like IGSA, GLI, all the other test labs and other trade associations and organizations, they've been enormously helpful in pushing that to happen, right? And we just got to keep charging down that path so that, yes, we'll have standardization, but then we need to figure out that, do I need to really go to every single market and have that same process work out? That's the reality right now. It's just unfortunate. Will we ever get beyond that? I think we will to some extent. We'll have greater reciprocity, but that would be, something for, again, the GA folks, the IGSA, the GLI folks, everybody else getting out there and educating the regulators that, hey, this has already been battle tested. It's been out in the marketplace in 5 other markets now. We've had no anomalies, or these are the choke points that we've had, and this is how it's been addressed, et cetera, et cetera.
So let me go back to something that Chris alluded to earlier. So in Ohio, and if I say something wrong, Chris, please jump in. But in Ohio, when they were getting ready to deploy sports betting, obviously the question of how do we validate and authenticate the software being used, is a major deal for regulators, right? And with a slot machine, it's easy. You go down to the slot machine. You can take the media out. You can run a hash over it. If you've got other technologies where you can do it remotely, you can do it, but all the software is in a slot machine that's on a casino floor. With online, well, the software is in a server. That server could be in a data center in your jurisdiction or a different jurisdiction, depending on your rules and requirements. So it becomes a bit more challenging. To solve that problem, Chris implemented one of IGSA standards called Network GATT. And GATT was developed a long time ago specifically for slot machine software testing. Network GATT was then evolved in order to do exactly what its name implies, to validate products over a network. It can be used to do that for slot machines, but it can also be used to do that for online software. So Ohio has implemented this software that has existed. It's been tried and true. It's proven. GATT is the most widely regulatory protocol that IGSA developed that is being used. And yet a lot of jurisdictions, I'll call them that, within the United States are not using GATT. I have no idea how they're authenticating the software that's being used. I know how Chris is doing it. And I know that the way Chris is doing it is very effective. And I think he can sleep well at night knowing that the software is indeed authentic and the version that was approved. Why isn't a standard like that why isn't everybody jumping on that and implementing it, right? And this goes to the whole idea of 50 different countries, of education, of why isn't there reciprocity in something that doesn't even require reciprocity? It just requires, oh wow, yeah, that really works. Hey Chris, how did you implement it? Wow, it's that easy, and it's providing you everything that you need. wow, we should be doing the same thing. Why isn't that happening, guys?
Yeah, that's a good question. I will point out though that it's maybe not as easy as you make it sound.
Okay, all right, fair enough.
The protocol is easy, and implementation, I think, can be easy if but it does require a little bit of effort. So we're lucky in Ohio that we have an in-house development team, and so we were able to build out the software necessary to make this an effective tool. I know a lot of regulators don't have that luxury of having like an in-house development crew, and there's not really an off-the-shelf product that they can just go, hey, I'm gonna use this product, and you have it'll work with the protocol. It's just not out there yet. I'm sure there'll be one at some point. So that, I think that's probably the biggest holdup and why it hasn't spread quicker than what it has.
Okay.
I think
Fair point.
I think we're really reactionary too, just generally, not just as people, but as regulators, you know, and until something sort of rears its ugly head, perhaps sometimes there's not an effort to avoid those issues from happening.
Yeah, and
And I
just
think,
that from our perspective, you know, in talking with that not every regulatory body has the budget or the size or the individuals to implement. And so whether it's a clearinghouse for responsible gaming to ensure you know, data's and privacy is protected, and that's going through a body like potentially Phil's company that he's working with, or somebody who's producing a network GAT. When you have standardization, we do need to have people step into that space and help provide these tools to the industry, and for the industry to be supportive of that process.
That I think that the points that you all made are very valid. And Chris, yes, you're right. You are lucky that you have an in-house development team. IGSA in the past has created toolkits and solutions. We've had, I would say, limited success in getting those actually adopted, so we're a little shy to do it again. But with something like Network GAT that has such the potential to be hugely beneficial, it is something that I believe is worthwhile looking at and figuring out if there's a way that we could create the application to help the regulators perhaps adopt it easier.
Can I add something there, Mark? Too?
Yeah, please.
Just coming at it from another perspective as well. You've got newer jurisdictions like Ohio, where Chris is at. So they're at the cutting edge of all the new technology, right? They've got the budget, they've got the development team that he's mentioning. They're able to implement those things a lot more rapidly because you didn't have like a market that's been going on for decades. Sort of old dogs, new tricks, difficult. Other markets around the country that may have been around, I won't mention any, like Nevada, may have had it, you know, we already had the marketplace for 50 years. Is anything broken? What's going to be the catalyst for me to say, okay, now we need to implement this as well? And I guess that goes back to my point of, until something breaks, sometimes there's not the desire to focus on certain things, and you're running off in other directions. And so I just was thinking about that as you guys were talking.
I think that's a very fair point.
Players, and it would just be a huge process in order to sometimes implement something new like that with these other markets that have been mature for a long time. That's why we have SaaS still.
Let's not go there, Phil. But no, I think all the points are very fair. Let me again piggyback on something else that Chris touched upon, and that is the concept of markets or wager catalogs. So yesterday, you know, we had a webinar as well. We had different sessions. And I asked, actually Phil was on one of those panels, and I asked a question related to markets and wager catalogs, and why are they different jurisdiction to jurisdiction, when essentially the game of American football, and this time I clarified it was American football, you know, that is the same, regardless of whether you're in Michigan, whether you're in Nevada, whether you're in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, you pick the jurisdiction. Football is football. Why are the markets different? I'm using markets just as an example to highlight why is there not a standard set of requirements across all US jurisdictions, and maybe asking for a standard set of requirements is a bit too much, right? Why isn't there a subset? Pick a percentage, 60%, 70%. You know, why can't we agree to a set of minimal requirements that are standard, and then allow for those unique jurisdictional requirements, because every single state has a different legislative body. The laws might be slightly different, the requirements might be slightly different. So we allow for that. But if the vast majority is the same, isn't that going to speed things up? So since Phil was on the panel yesterday, I'll look at Joe and Chris to provide the answers first, and then see if Phil has any additional thoughts.
So my thought on that would be kind of what we've been talking about up to this point, of having hundreds of separate countries within the United States when it comes to gambling jurisdictions, right? So if every jurisdiction were coming online at the same time, I think you'd see where a lot of jurisdictions would be doing things the same way, because I don't think the rules, regulations, or the legislative requirements in the different jurisdictions are that different. There are some differences, to your point, but they're not extreme differences. But I think it's pretty standard practice for new jurisdictions as they come online to look at previous jurisdictions that have come online recently, see what their processes are, communicate with them, say, how are you handling this? Here's where our rules overlap and they're very similar. What processes do you have in place? Where are your pain points? And then as a new jurisdiction, you're going to sit down and think about, okay, I don't have the budget for staff to handle this operation area like that jurisdiction does. So I need to come up with ways of doing it more efficiently or differently to meet what I have access to from a resource perspective. Of course, that process then, when you move from jurisdiction, it just waterfalls, where now we have these wholly different procedures being done to fulfill the same exact need in all these different jurisdictions. Unfortunately, and then to Phil's point, as he said earlier, the older jurisdictions maybe then could look back at some of the new ones and say, hey, they're doing this in a much more efficient manner with less staff or maybe with new technology. However, there's no catalyst to change the process we already have in place, and it would maybe a difficult task to retool and change what's already working. So there's that catalyst piece to push the jurisdictions that are already established to get to a different procedure or process or standard to do the same task that they're already doing.
Yeah, and I would say there's a big appetite within the regulatory community, especially on the regulatory side, for standardization. Exactly like Chris said, regulators look to what's happening in another market and controls. They talk to each other as well to figure out what is that best of breed. And from a pure regulation and technical requirements, there is a level of standardization. We're big advocates for it. GLI 33 is the technical standard for sports wagering that's widely adopted across the US. Over 80% of the jurisdictions, sets a foundational layer. Then above that, the regulations from each jurisdiction sit that come from legislative mandate. And that's nothing that you can do from a regulatory side to prevent that legislative mandate. Well, when the legislators in Ohio decide that they want to add some unique requirements, you have to turn that into regulation and enforce that. But you can layer that on a level of standardization. But where I think there's a lot of opportunity that we haven't yet captured is looking at the data points, the event wager catalogs. There are going to be some states that don't allow college betting or betting on events just within the state. Those are the variations, or may not allow something like table tennis where another state will. But how can regulators come together and look at all those key regulatory points and say, this is how data can be exchanged, how we can receive that data from operators so that they can standardize that to start narrowing 50 to 100 or more jurisdictions and that complexity down to just a few, because things in the online world move faster. just a lot faster. And we need to leverage data, and we need to leverage standardization, new concepts, new technologies, when regulating the marketplace, in the same way that the operators who are out there competing against each other need to leverage those technologies to draw in their customers.
And to just expand on that, specifically from the wager catalog perspective, I don't know that you ever get to a point where every jurisdiction agrees on every event. Like, hey, every jurisdiction is going to offer all of these events, and that's just a standard. I don't think that's where standardization is ever going to get to in that area. But standardization and how an operator can see or pull the data from a regulator on what's approved and what's not, I think would be just as helpful as having a standard across every jurisdiction, right? Because right now it's a very painful manual process for operators to go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and manually flip on switches on what markets and bets are available for that jurisdiction. Whereas if there was a way they could just pull, hey, I need the catalog for this jurisdiction, the system could pull it in, flag it automatically, and only offer what's available in that jurisdiction. I think that to them would probably be just as easy as having the same markets across all.
And I guess the reciprocal of that would be if there was a standard way for the operators to submit, for new markets to be evaluated, approved, and added to the catalog. That would also be helpful, right? Because at least there's one way you do it now, as opposed to 50, 100, 150 different ways.
I think that would be helpful. It would be more challenging, I think, just because the way that the different jurisdictions, different regulators evaluate what's approved and not approved as a market in their jurisdiction. I think there's differing areas of importance based on legislative mandate and or even just political ties at the time.
You're going to have a different culture in every state. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah. And in the end, though, the jurisdictions or the regulators themselves have to be convinced that standardization is going to be beneficial to their market. They have to be convinced to take that step, to actually put forth the resources and the efforts in order to do that. Because, how is this going to help me? So
to dream a little bit, and to go back to a technology I mentioned earlier. So, blockchain, right? The concept of a distributed ledger, where you've got multiple different nodes and data is available to all of those nodes instantaneously, right? And that data cannot be changed. With something like that, where now every regulatory authority that has allowed sports betting could see the wager category requests and the wager category approvals, and decide, yes, I'm buying into approving this for my jurisdiction or not, right? Based on other jurisdictions potentially approving it, knowing, again, noted what you said, that every jurisdiction is going to have their legislative mandates, their political issues, their, as was said yesterday, their level of comfort with one particular, wager type versus another. But at least they can see in one standardized real-time manner everything that's being submitted and being approved by other jurisdictions. Would that not be helpful? Or is that, such a big pipe dream as something that's never going to become reality?
I think it'd be helpful. I think it's a big dream as well. How's that?
Sounds fair.
Standardization and harmonization across the jurisdictions in the US would lead to greater compliance, greater integrity for all sports betting.
But I'm not even saying harmonization. What I'm basically saying is right now, right? I think if I were to somehow extrapolate what Chris was saying, because every jurisdiction has a different market wager category approval process, it is very hard for me, if I was the regulator in Timbuktu, to know exactly what somebody is doing in New Jersey or Michigan or Ohio or Pennsylvania. Very difficult for me. So I don't know if should I even consider this. I mean, I think you mentioned table tennis. Should I even consider it? Is cornhole a legitimate sport? Is X throwing a legitimate sport? Should I allow wagers on X throw? I have no idea, right? But then if you see what other jurisdictions are doing, and you see that, oh, look at this, Nevada is accepting this, and Pennsylvania is accepting this, and somebody else is accepting it. At least as a regulator, number one, it'll give you the ability to pick up the phone, assuming you have a relationship, and say, why are you accepting this? What are the rules around it? What are the risk limitations that you've put in place, or mitigations, to make sure this is not exploited, and then decide, oh, should I do it or not? Right now, you're sort of blind. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity in this area. And specifically on that point, now, I'm not speaking for every regulatory body, because some operate independently with respect to the allowing wagers on different categories of events and the like. But many look to each other and say, if this is approved in another jurisdiction, that's going to carry weight as to whether or not I'm going to approve that event as something that can be added to our catalog. And right now it's a manual process to go look that up. A lot of times it is posted publicly, but where it's posted, how it's posted, is in all different forums. And so to get data into people's hands faster, into a single interface without having to look for it, whether it's that information, whether it's approval information, when it comes to certification, from a test lab like ourselves, we've looked at this technology as well, and you leveraging it for a similar reason. But there's also approvals from app stores, there's approvals from payment providers, there's new partnerships. All of that information needs to be known. All of those boxes need to be checked. Right now, that information is flowing more manually than automated, and so getting that information into a better technology is, again, a huge opportunity. And you can even expand beyond that, which I'm sure Chris deals with on a day-to-day basis, which is change management, a concept, again, that we're very much advocates for at GLI, and have put out a standard on it. But submitting changes to individual regulatory bodies and saying these changes are not of a sensitive nature, but they need to be deployed immediately because we're in an online world. And we need sign off of those changes before they're deployed. Right now, there's sign off processes that are unique per state, and how you deliver those changes, how they're reviewed, and the approvals that come back for that is unique per state. So again, huge opportunity there for standardization, and regulatory bodies are not operating in a non-standard way because they want to. They needed to solve a problem, and they needed to implement a process, and they've done that. And where a better process comes along, I think that there would be a lot of appetite to adopt.
So that's exactly, and Phil, I'm going to quote what you said yesterday, right? A lot of regulations have very tight timeframes within which, specifically to sports betting, they had to get their approvals, they had to get everything set up, they had to be up and running. So quite frankly, they didn't, in some cases, have the time to really evaluate and implement and adopt and adapt, everything that was out there, because, well, they had a mandate and they had to be up and running by January 1st, and they did what they needed to do to be up and running first and foremost in as efficient and effective and accurate manner as possible, with the eye to go back and sort of evaluate and figure out what could be done potentially better in the future. So I agree with everything that you said. IGSA has a standard that's been adopted by the major labs in the United States, called the Certification Database Interface. CDI is a data exchange standard for regulators, suppliers, and potentially even operators to see what products are being submitted, what products are being tested, what products are being approved. It can be used by suppliers to do notifications for gaming devices that are being shipped from one location to a different jurisdiction. So it's got a lot of this sort of node concept without using distributed ledger technology. It was developed several years ago, so it used whatever technology was available then. It has been adopted. It is being used by some jurisdictions, and again, it's one of these things where I think a lot of jurisdictions aren't even aware that it exists. And this leads me to another question. You know, we as IGSA spend a lot of time talking to regulatory authorities. Just like GLI does, we attend NAGRA, we attend the International Association of Gaming Regulatory Authorities meetings. We talk to regulators. We've got a regulatory committee that Chris is the chairperson on. We haven't met for a few months, possibly my fault. But we talk to regulators a lot, and we try to get the education out there of what already exists and to understand what issues are you facing that could potentially be solved through standardization. Could you guys offer some thoughts, some ideas on how we could do that better, how we can disseminate information better, and how we could get regulators to, you know, get off their daily grind, because, you know, they're very busy, they've got limited staffs, limited budgets, they've got work they've got to get done, and have the time to evaluate these other things that could potentially make their lives better, easier, and provide better, you know, results. Any ideas?
Maybe not an idea. I think what you guys are doing from an outreach perspective, I don't know that you can do much more. And I think, to what Joe said earlier, a lot of regulators are interested in improving their operations and using these new methods. But when you approach them and say, hey, we have these standards, allows you to do this, this, and this, their eyes get wide, they perk up, and then they're waiting for you to say, and here's the product you need to do it. And that part never comes. And you're like, wait, I have to build it? Or, well, who can I call to buy? There's nobody out there. So unfortunately, there's a piece missing that for a lot of regulators, it's not an off the shelf, out of the box, like, hey, if you do this, fixes this problem for you, or makes this so much more efficient, or you gain all of these advantages of this standard. But the standard doesn't work without the other piece, the product part of it.
Phil, as an ex-regulator, do you concur?
I do, and there needs to be continual outreach. We talked about this yesterday too. Without the help of organizations like the IGSA and other trade associations, membership groups, the labs, and the outreach that they've done, the manufacturers and suppliers themselves, the operators, the platform suppliers, everybody's out there, but they're not necessarily always neutral parties, right? And they're sort of viewed with some level of skepticism. But folks like yourself that are neutral arbiters, it's hugely important in moving the market forward and getting towards better standards together. I can't say enough about it. That's why I've always been supportive, and I always had an open door in talking with all the different organizations, just to have an ear in case there was something we would be able to do to help the industry.
Joe, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, we have a software development team where we're using CDI with Chris and his team. We're very much on board with standardization, but there is that limitation that we're running into, where, you know, we're happy to supply a product if that's something that the industry wants, or we need that body to step in, an independent body to manage information and to close that gap. And as we see that, again, ourselves and, you know, I know from the supplier side, the way that they've supported jurisdictions like Ohio with Network Gap, they're willing to step up and implement. But there's that key piece that we do need to solve.
Awesome. I'm checking to see if we have any questions. None have been posed so far. So I'll ask one last question with about 5 or 6 minutes left in this webinar. As I was mentioning at the very beginning, right before we formally kicked this off, in a panel yesterday, one of the panelists mentioned that whether intentionally or unintentionally, all of the jurisdictions that have so far approved sports betting and the ones that will approve sports betting moving forward have opened the door to iGaming, right? So we see iGaming, whether you want to call it iCasino, whether you want to call it online slots, whatever terminology you want to use, it's really where many states will potentially eventually go. And the question is, what are the consequences of us taking that additional step without having some level of standardization to shore up our basement? And Joe, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. It adds another layer of complexity. And most regulators, when we talk to them, know that this is coming. They're asking us questions. How is this regulated in the handful of states that have it today? How is it managed? But there's more transactions, more parties involved. And really, the thing that we don't always ask it, we look at advantages, but what are the disadvantages? What are the consequences when we don't look to standardize, when we don't look to continue to innovate and add best of breed procedures and protocols? And what that is that's a slowdown to the industry. So there is a very big carrot for the industry to look at and say, we need to be supportive of standardization so that bodies, like the Ohio Casino Control Commission, where Chris is at, have the facility to be able to take on this large, new, and very fast evolving industry and manage it without having to put in protocols and procedures to meet legislative mandates that are more archaic. So if the industry can come together and agree on standardization, can agree on protocols, and we're going to be supportive, many of the regulatory bodies are going to be supportive, it's going to set a foundation layer. And if not, some of the things that the industry wants to do won't be possible, at least on the timetables that they want, without that foundation in place.
Chris, what do you think?
I think iGaming, once you add that, I mean, some jurisdictions are struggling with sports gaming. The amount of changes, the amount of information, it's a lot. Having had to deal with it now for 9 months or so, it's a lot more volume. But you throw iGaming in there, and to Joe's point, multiples of what it is currently with sports gaming. Sports gaming is just one piece. You throw iGaming in there, and now you've got multiple different facets of a system that aren't there currently, from all the random outcome generation and all of it. It just becomes that much more of a hassle and that much more of a burden on the regulator. So without some sort of standards going forward, it's going to become very difficult to manage.
Yeah, and the first consequence there is you're going to need a lot more technical and regulatory compliance staff in order to manage all these. That's the very first consequence there. But one potential consequence as well is as we get to a world where, I agree, it's probably inevitable that we're going to have, more and more online gaming markets. I think we have 6 right now, if I'm not mistaken, but 40 sports betting. Sports betting only has been out there for about 5 years, essentially. We're at 30 to about 40. Online gaming, I guess the first one would have been New Jersey. We only have 6, and that's in the span of 10 years-ish. So I think it's a slower march with online gaming for sure, no doubt. But you're going to have the push from the operators, because the operators that are sports betting operators also have their casino verticals online as well. And that's really where they're making more of their money anyway. So there's going to be a push there, but it's going to be a slower walk, I think, on that front. So.
Awesome. So basically, we've got opportunities here from an industry perspective, opportunities from an IGSA perspective, and from a regulatory perspective to sit down and really continue to have frank and open discussions around what is working today, what is not working today, where can standards be implemented, how could they be implemented, and how can we facilitate the implementation? Because to the points that were raised, saying I've got a standard that is a technological specification as opposed to having a real application solution are very different things. So I wanted to thank you all for your participation. Thank you to the attendees, and look forward to discussing these topics with you all independently and hopefully together in the future. So with that, I'll formally end this webinar, and thank you very much.